For the first time since the beginning of Putin's war against Ukraine, Russia seems to be winning. Yes, Ukraine continues to enjoy victories along the way. It's recaptured about half of the territory Russia took and managed to leave Putin feeling embarrassed in the geopolitical sphere. But this is a war of attrition, and as CNN points out, Ukraine is heavily reliant on support from the West to fight against Russian forces. That support is starting to waver. Elections are on the horizon in countries like Poland, with that country's farmers, traditionally supporters of Ukraine, starting to pick fights with their close neighbors. And even in the United States, we've seen Republicans in the Senate block a $60 billion aid package to Ukraine over immigration policy disputes. Domestic politics are starting to impact the West's previously unfaltering support for Ukraine, which is bad news for Zelensky. Nevertheless, the war is still ongoing, and regardless of which way it goes, the West will have a problem on its hands dealing with ongoing Russian aggression. Should Putin win and actually claim Ukraine as Russian territory, he'll be emboldened enough to try it all again with other countries that he believes should be a part of his burgeoning empire. But the situation may not be much better if he loses. Putin would have to retreat to lick his wounds. Still, he'd be humiliated on a global scale, which is something that he's unlikely to take lying down. So what does the West do about all this? How does it solve the problem of Russian aggression going forward? And frankly, is it a problem that can be solved in the first place? The West has to try, and its first port of call will be one of its strongest organizations, NATO. Founded in 1949, NATO exists for collective defense. Each of its members vows to defend all other members from aggression by committing money, arms, and soldiers, both to NATO itself and in some cases directly to member countries. The idea is to create an organization that has so much collective military might that its members are essentially shielded from attacks. And right now, the group has 32 member states, all from Europe and North America. Putin knows that an attack on one NATO member nation is an attack on them all. And many other countries know this too. NATO has undergone multiple rounds of enlargement since its founding, growing from its original 12 member nations to the 32 we see now. Its most recent member, Sweden, joined the group in March 2024, and it's far from the only country that wants in on the collective defensive power of the organization. According to NATO, 3 more of its partner countries, Georgia, Ukraine, and Bosnia and Herzegovina, have declared their desire to become full members. A stronger and more united NATO is a threat to Putin. He's long spouted rhetoric about the group essentially being a puppet organization designed to enhance Western, specifically American influence around the world. And he's not altogether wrong. NATO is an extremely Western-focused group, and its members actively defend the West's interests. The strengthening of that group by adding new members would cause problems for Putin on 2 fronts. First, it obviously leads to more collective defensive bargaining power for NATO, turning it into an even stronger force. And second, every new member that NATO brings under its umbrella is a country that Putin would have to think twice about before attacking. After all, that's the point of the collective defense. If Putin were to attack, say, Bosnia and Herzegovina right now, the West would surely deliver financial aid and weaponry, but it's unlikely that it would get involved directly in the conflict. If that country is successful in its NATO application, though, then all other NATO members have a more direct obligation to fight against any aggressors, and therein may lie the first key to the West's containment of Russian aggression in the aftermath of Putin's war. The strengthening of NATO would be akin to the mutually assured destruction scenario of the Cold War. Only instead of "we'll nuke you if you nuke us," the threat is if you attack one of us, you attack all of us. This is not to say nuclear weapons wouldn't get involved soon after too, but that's a grim scenario for another video. The safety net of mutual defense is the reason why Ukraine wants to be a member. It knows it would get more direct military support if it becomes part of NATO, which would spell bad news for Putin's ambitions for Kyiv. Even if Ukraine is unsuccessful, both in the war and its membership application, it seems likely that Putin's going to have to deal with a more powerful NATO once this war ends. That new NATO may not be restricted to Europe and North America. In July 2022, NATO held its annual summit in Madrid. For the first time, several heads of state from the Indo-Pacific region had a presence at the meeting. Specifically, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand all took part, with the goal for NATO being to discuss global geopolitical and security challenges in Asia as well as the West. Those nations also attended the 2023 summit in Vilnius, which is worrying news for Putin. This isn't the only example of the West building stronger ties with its Asian partners. In August 2023, heads of state from Japan and South Korea visited President Joe Biden at Camp David to discuss the trilateral cooperation between the three nations. We've also seen a ramping up of joint training exercises being conducted by those three countries, as well as Australia, all of which are intended as a display of power. That display seems mostly directed at China. Furthermore, it's certainly no guarantee of the future formation of an Asian NATO to complement the Western organization. China would have something to say about that, though both Le Monde Diplomatique and Foreign Policy say that it's not a completely far-flung idea. After all, an alliance of Eastern nations to curb Chinese aggression would serve a similar purpose to the Western NATO and its efforts to control Russia. But speaking of Russia, what effect would an Asian NATO, or an even stronger partnership between the West and countries like Japan and South Korea, have on Putin? It all comes down to the partnership between China and Russia. Though China hasn't officially supplied weapons to Russia during Putin's war, having tried to toe a neutral line throughout, it has condemned the West for creating a situation that sparked it. Plus, China and Russia have close economic ties. Trade between the two countries rose to $218.2 billion during 2023, more than double the $107 billion achieved in 2018 and $18.2 billion more than China and Russia's joint goal of $200 billion by 2024. Expansion of NATO into Asia would at least enable it to better track these trade agreements, potentially setting the stage for sanctions in the future. That being said, it's unlikely that either China or Russia would be stopped by such sanctions. Increased cooperation from Eastern countries would at least help NATO enforce trade blockades or similar measures that could have an adverse impact on Russia's economy. Speaking of sanctions, that's an area where the West would have to revisit. Many Western countries imposed sanctions on Moscow once Putin started his war. For instance, the European Union, EU, massively increased its sanctions, which had started in March 2014, to include a range of new organizations and individuals. The US and the UK did the same thing, all with the goal of either deterring the sanctioned bodies or compelling them to act differently. Simply put, they didn't really work. Politico points out that even though the scope of these sanctions were unprecedented and did impact the Russian economy, they did little to change the course of Putin's war. Worse yet, the impact on Russia's economy was minor. In 2022, the year most of these sanctions were introduced, Russia still managed to overtake Germany in terms of gross domestic product, or GDP, as related to purchasing power parity. This was the first time that happened since records started. And right now, Russia sits fifth on that particular list, behind only China, the United States, India, and Japan. You'll notice that only one of those countries is a Western nation, highlighting that economic sanctions likely aren't the way forward following the war. That's a problem for the West. It has long used sanctions to control countries with economic punishments for, quote, bad behavior. Seeing Russia not only absorb those sanctions but grow in spite of them could lead to the development of a new approach. What that approach might be is difficult to determine. Western countries may have to start at home to figure out the problem. In a June 2023 article, Al Jazeera reported on research conducted by Corisk, a Norwegian risk consultancy company that looked into how many companies have circumvented the sanctions their own countries have placed on Russia. The study looked at 12 EU countries, along with the US, UK, and Japan. The results were astonishing. Customs data from those countries showed that companies had circumvented export sanctions to the tune of $8.5 billion in 2022 alone. Germany was the biggest offender, as it combined with Lithuania to provide about half of the Western products that Russia shouldn't be able to import. Semiconductors, tech, machinery, and quantum computers were all among the goods sold, with a report claiming that the trading countries essentially used smaller nations as intermediaries to provide neutral ground for the handoffs. Al Jazeera points out that these countries may have been Georgia, Armenia, and primarily Kazakhstan. Exports to all of these shot up in 2022, starting from when the West placed the sanctions on Russia. Putin found a workaround, showcasing the weaknesses in the sanction approach that the West had hoped would control him. The West has to change its approach in the wake of the war. If it truly wishes to control Russian aggression, it has to make its sanctions more effective. That would mean moving focus beyond Moscow and toward the countries that act as intermediaries to funnel Western goods into Russia. Might the West have to sanction the likes of Armenia and Kazakhstan too? Would it be willing to do so, given that sanctions against these smaller countries would cause economic chaos and potentially deepen their ties to Moscow? That's a complicated problem. What's more likely is that Western countries will introduce greater punishments for individuals and organizations at home. There has to be a deterrent to the domestic, greedy, and corrupt, as well as to Russia itself, if sanctions are going to have anything close to their intended effect when the war in Ukraine ends. Another containment option lies in the expulsion from groups that allow Russia to exert its geopolitical influence. We saw that approach in action in March 2014, when Russia was expelled from the G8, turning it into the G7, as a response to its annexation of Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula. The group is a collective of some of the world's most powerful nations, with the aim being to work somewhat collectively to influence geopolitical trends and confront global issues. Russia's expulsion was intended to be a punishment, a reduction of the volume of its voice in global geopolitics. But despite calls by some, including Donald Trump during his presidency, to reintroduce Russia into the group, it seems that remains unlikely in the near future. However, it's clear that expulsion from the G8 hasn't done much to hinder Russia's ambitions. So the West might have to take things even further if it's to make Putin really feel the heat of being excluded from the global community. That might include expulsion from the G20, a similar though larger group of economic powers, as well as an examination into Russia's place on the UN Security Council. Neither seems likely. In a 2020 article, market intelligence group S&P Global pointed out that Russia is unlikely to be kicked out of the G20. Too many of its members are against the country's removal, with several of those that are on the fence likely to be driven by their own national interests ahead of punishing Russia. Stripping Russia from its place on the UN Security Council also seems like an impossibility. Despite calls from some, including Ukrainian Ambassador Sergei Kyslytsya, for Russia to lose its place because it's more of a threat than an arbiter of peace, there may be little the UN could do to remove it. Russia is one of the Council's 5 permanent members, or P5, along with China, France, the US, and the UK, meaning that it has veto power. Any move for expulsion would be met with a swift veto from Putin, as would any attempt to change the Council's rules to remove veto power or change the rules that govern the Council. The UN backed itself into a corner. With the benefit of hindsight, it's easy to say that the P5 should never have been given the ability to veto UN actions in the first place, but it has that veto power, which means there's practically nothing that anybody could do to remove Russia from the Council. Even if expulsion were possible, both from G20 and the Security Council, it might not do much to deter Russia. It's a member of BRICS, too, over which the West holds practically no influence, and it's clear that losing its place in the G7 has done little to curb Russia's economic strength, given that we've seen it overtake Germany for GDP related to purchasing power parity. Perhaps then the better approach for the West is to work with Russia within the auspices of these groups. Rather than stifling Putin's influence, it could use its own to stymie his ambitions internally while outwardly showing Moscow that it still has an important voice in geopolitics. It would be a delicate game, with tactical concessions being used to guide Moscow in the direction the West wants it to follow. But it seems like a game that the West will have to play to contain Putin's ambitions, given that complete expulsion from such powerful groups isn't an option. Speaking of concessions, there's an important question we've yet to cover. What if Russia loses? It's still a possibility, even if Russia seems to currently be coming out on top of its war of attrition. And if it happens, Russian aggression could increase because a humiliated Putin might feel that a display of power could help him wipe the egg off his face. The West could use concessions to limit the extent of that retaliatory aggression. According to Brookings' November 2022 examination into the Talbot Papers on implications of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, these concessions would likely start with territory, and that giving up of territory could start with Moscow relinquishing control of Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant that Putin decreed as being owned by Russia in October 2022. As Europe's largest nuclear power station, it's a pivotal European security concern because it presents a risk of nuclear catastrophe. Russian forces occupying the plant are currently overseeing the Ukrainian staff that manages it, creating extremely difficult working conditions that could lead to oversights in a very delicate operation. Brookings argues that reclaiming this territory would be a priority for the West in the case of a Russian loss, not just to avert disaster, but to reassert Western control over such a powerful energy source. Furthermore, this territorial concession would open the door for the resumption of talks between Moscow and Washington on nuclear arms control, another issue that worries many in the West. Brookings argues that the West, particularly the US, would express a strong interest in replacing the New START treaty with the aim of reducing Russia's nuclear capabilities. For his part, Putin has made threats, empty ones so far, about using nukes in Ukraine. The West would want to make sure those threats can't be made against other countries in the future, and would likely use a Russian defeat as the platform for talks about further disarmament of Russia's extensive stockpile. Of course, nuclear concessions wouldn't come without a quid pro quo. Moscow would expect the US to also continue its disarmament, as well as potentially bring China into the mix, given that it's expanding its own nuclear stockpile. But the West may use these talks as an opportunity to open a dialogue about Russia's non-strategic nuclear weapons, about which very little data exists. These are nukes that cover a range of 5,500 kilometers, or approximately 3,400 miles, and are typically in the kiloton range. They're a worry for the West because of a change Russia made to its military doctrine in 2014. Beyond using these weapons in response to nuclear threats by other nations, Russia said that it would consider using them in the event of another country using conventional weapons if it believed the very existence of Russia was under threat. That doctrine puts paid to any flight of fancy notions that Russia could be deconstructed should it lose the war in Ukraine. It also makes the possibility of a direct conflict against Russia, whether it wins or loses, a near impossibility. The West simply doesn't want Moscow to fall back on this change of doctrine as an excuse to launch nukes if it started to lose a conventional war that would threaten the existence of Russia. So, concessions would be the likely approach. The West would want more information about Russia's stockpiles and may push for both disarmament and a commitment to a doctrine that says that Russia won't launch when conventional weapons are used against it. How open Russia would be to such talks, and whether it would abide by a rule not to launch in the case of conventional warfare, remains to be seen. But at least a conversation about concessions could start. After all, the disintegration of Russia isn't an option. As argued in a February 2023 article, the dissolution of the Russian state would basically open the door for China to become a more powerful influence over the West. Russia might devolve into a satellite for Beijing, with China gaining control of the eastern part of the country, along with the raw materials and military advantages that this territory would provide. The West would be able to do little to stop such a move, meaning the loss of Russia could result in the growth of China, with Beijing becoming a global threat on at least an equal scale to Moscow. So Russia will stand regardless of the war's outcome. However, that mention of China brings us to the final concern for the West that we'll cover in this video: the strengthening of ties between Moscow and Beijing. You've already seen how much stronger those ties are economically than they were just 5 years ago. Militaristically, the picture is a little less clear. China's official position is that it doesn't supply Russia with weapons to aid it in its war with Ukraine. However, China has also been quick to condemn the West for the role it supposedly played in the invasion, claiming that the US ignored Putin's concerns about Ukraine to the point where he was provoked into an attack. And despite Beijing's official line being that it doesn't supply Russia with weapons, Ukraine would likely argue about the validity of this stance. An April 2023 report published in Reuters highlighted a video call in which Vladislav Vlasic, an advisor to Ukraine's chief of staff, pointed out an unforeseen result of the West's sanctions. The trend is now that there are less Western-made components, but more, not hard to guess which country, made components, he said, before capping the claim with a simple statement. Of course, China. China may not be supplying Russia with weapons, but it's providing components that Putin can use to build equipment he can deploy on a battlefield. That alone is evidence enough that China's ties to Russia are only growing stronger. When the war ends, the West will need to focus on curtailing these ties as much as possible. Sanctions in their current format clearly don't work, be they against China or Russia. We've seen that over the last few years. That may be why expanding its presence and partnerships into Asia is such a priority for NATO right now. It may also be why the US is so focused on building its trilateral relationship with Japan and South Korea. It's not just Russia that the West will need to contain following the Ukraine war. China is just as much of a threat, with the possibility of a more direct military alliance forming between Russia and China, potentially fueling Putin's aggression after the war. One thing is for certain, containing Russian aggression, whether the country wins or loses its war, won't be easy. Sanctions need to be revisited and reinforced to prevent corruption. NATO will have to strengthen, as it's already doing, and an ever-watchful eye will need to be placed on China to prevent it from supporting Russia's aggression going forward. Concessions may be an option should Ukraine win. Still, the more likely approach will be to expand Western influence and power and make it even harder for Putin to turn his eye to new territory should he succeed in taking Ukraine. Now we'd like to know what you think. We've covered a few of the approaches the West might take to contain Russia, but you may be able to think of more. Tell us about them, and also where you think the West may struggle in the comments section below. Now watch this, or check out this other video.